Hi, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and last night I wanted to know how peace-minded realists in Russia and Britain thought about the war in Ukraine and the state of affairs in Europe more generally. So I talked to Dmitri Trenin and Anatol Lieven, both of whom have worked on Eastern European security for decades. Dmitri Trenin was the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. He also used to serve in the Soviet and Russian armed forces from 1972 to 1993. He's the author of the 2019 book, Russia, in which he explains the country's rollercoaster journey from revolution to post-war devastation to Vladimir Putin's Russia today. On the other side, Anatol Lieven is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From 1985 to 1998, he worked as a journalist in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and covered the wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Southern Caucasus. He authored the books Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry, and America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism. Well, here's our discussion. Well, Dmitri Trenin and Anatol Lieven, thank you very much for taking the time of talking to me today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Maybe let me start with just asking both of you, how are you doing? How are you keeping up with 3 months of what has been going on? Maybe you first, Dmitri, and then Anatol.
Well, it's certainly a very difficult period. And in many ways, it looks like it's open-ended. There's the reality of a war going on in Ukraine, but there's a wider reality of what people call the hybrid war between Russia and the West. So even when the hostilities in Ukraine come to a stop at some point, as they will, the larger conflict will continue. So we're looking at something which is in most respects as fundamental and destructive as the Cold War was in the 20th century.
That's very grim indeed. Anatol, what's your take?
Yes, I'm afraid I agree with that, and I mean, probably like Dmitri, as somebody who's worked for 30 years now, to try to improve or at least maintain decent relations between Russia and the West and avoid conflict. This is very much a personal tragedy for me. I suppose, though, following on from what Dmitri said, if you take the analogy of the Cold War, we can still try to work to prevent the bad becoming the completely catastrophic. In other words, I'm afraid Dmitri's quite right. The wider, not hopefully, I mean, pray God, not direct conflict, but Cold War will continue. But of course, even during the Cold War, there were of course, the most important thing, we managed to avoid nuclear cataclysm, although we came awfully close a couple of times. And on other things, there were disasters that occurred that could, with slightly more wisdom, have been avoided. Even in the context of the Cold War, America did not need to go into Vietnam. The Soviet Union did not need to go into Afghanistan. So, we can keep that in mind.
Okay, then maybe let me continue asking you about the articles that you wrote. Dmitri, you wrote this article that you published in English in Russia Today, based on a speech that you gave at the 30th Assembly of the Russian Council of Foreign Affairs and Defense Policy. Could you maybe explain the main arguments of your article and what worries you the most for Russia in this current conflict?
Well, I would first of all, I do not. I don't think I can recite the main themes of that article because you just you move on and you come up with all sorts of new thinking, all sorts of new ideas almost every day. I would say this on responding to the question that you posed. I see this as an existential test for the Russian Federation. The kind of I'm not talking about the military side of it, although it's very important, but primarily I'm talking about the economic side, the technological side, the social, societal side of all that, the ideological, the values side. And basically, even before February this year, I'd come to the conclusion that the model that the Russian Federation had been following since the end of the Soviet Union had run its course, essentially. That we as a nation would not be able to go very much forward without some fundamental changes in the way that our economy works, our elite is composed, the way it's composed, the way it's behaving. The lack of firm values in society, to me, was a very big issue and growingly important. And certainly Russia's relations with the rest of the world was also an element in this wider scheme. So I basically look at the current situation, not just in Ukraine, not just in the military sphere, but more broadly, as a very big test. And suddenly Russia has become cut off from the Western financial system, Western economic system, Western technological system, financial, and given the dominance, the continued dominance of the West in the world, you are facing a set of huge problems, truly huge. And unless you get your act together and come up with a model that would permit you to grow and develop, as well as preserve and strengthen internal harmony inside the country, well, the whole thing is going to end pretty badly. So to me, that's it's really existential. And for Russia to live up to the task that it faces today, it needs, in many ways, new approaches, just anywhere you might look.
And Anatol, I believe you wrote something about this, the perception that this is an existential crisis for Russia, right? Could you explain that?
Yes, well, I mean, I wanted to bring out in this piece the fact that, as is, has been familiar from, I think, many conflicts in history, that in principally because of the nature of the Western response and the US response, a great many Russians who certainly did not want to launch this invasion, did not support the invasion, may even privately have regarded the invasion as a disaster. Faced with, what does so often look and sound like, as Dmitri has said, an essentially existential threat to Russia. Essentially take elements of the West at their word, and also believe that this has become an existential threat. I mean, on that score, I suppose there are two things to be added, though. The first is that As a European, I mean, a kind of European, if a Brit is still a European, I have found the whole West European approach, not so much since the war began, perhaps, but in the run up to the war, and yes, I mean, today as well, profoundly pathetic, because it's not actually true that most of the leaders of Western Europe, if you look at Macron, Scholz, the Italians, wanted this to be an existential conflict, or regarded as an existential conflict to this day. And, you know, there has been all this talk of trying to find some compromise, of trying to find what, you know, a way out of the war. But in the end, they have never been prepared to actually confront America on this, you know, to actually defy America. And so you have this, you know, terrible sense of European witlessness and impotence. The other thing, though, I would just like to add is that while, as Dmitri has said, as I've recognized in other Russians, you know, this is now regarded as an existential conflict, and this is, and as I say, this is echoing the way it's being portrayed in so much of the Western media as well, of this sort of supposed Russian existential threat to Western democracy. If you look at the military situation today, it's not like that at all. This is a rather grimly familiar post-colonial conflict over very limited amounts of territory. You know, by now, given the way that the two sides are fighting each other to a standstill, you're really only talking about, you know, battles for half a dozen medium-sized towns in the Donbass. So the military reality on the ground is quite different from, you know, the sort of the wider existential terms in which this conflict has been cast by both sides.
Dmitri, do you see it the same way?
Well, I think that certainly and I said it before, certainly the larger conflict is way bigger than the battlefield in Ukraine. And the issues that are central to this conflict are much bigger than Ukraine. It is, in principle, the special military operation by Russia is officially defined as a way to liberate the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So it's quite a limited goal. But the reality of Russia being pitted against the entire Western world is way, way bigger than that. And it is also unprecedented. Never before in history has Russia faced a unified Western world. In all the wars that Russia fought before, there were parts of the Western world that were against Russia. They were being confronted by Russia on the battlefield, but then there were allies. They were allies during the Napoleonic Wars. They were allies during the First and Second World Wars. And even during the Cold War, they were neutrals. There are no longer any neutrals left. And Russia faces a coalition of some 40 nations, 40 plus nations, I understand, that are united in their opposition to Russia, in military terms, economic terms, financial terms, technological terms, political and diplomatic terms, even in cultural terms. Now, this is, as I said, unprecedented. And the reality on the ground in Ukraine is no adequate measure to define the real scale of the conflict. It goes way beyond what Anatol has been talking about.
I was only speaking in purely narrow military terms.
Absolutely, absolutely, Anatol. This is this is not meant as criticism. I was actually using your phrase is to illustrate my point. So I'm fully with you on that.
I like to think about having two conflicts going on at the same time: a hot war or military operation in Ukraine, and a larger cold structural conflict. Although Ambassador Jack Matlock keeps pointing out that this is not a second Cold War. The Cold War was predicated on two completely different ideologies of how society should be structured, and that's not the case anymore. Everybody agrees on the basics of the structure, but we still have the conflict going on. And you, Dmitri, point out that it's existential, and also in your piece you pointed out that the West is not willing to even accept some residual, or how did you point it, the West is refusing to accept even the perfunctory neutrality of individual countries. Does this include this proposed neutrality of Ukraine, or also do you see like what's happening with Finland and Sweden in the same way?
Well, not. It's difficult for me, frankly, to imagine a neutral Ukraine. After everything that's happened in the last 100+ days, I just don't see how Ukraine can function as a neutral state. So we'll see what happens eventually, but I cannot see that. And also, again, highlighting the issue I raised a few minutes ago, there is no more room for neutrality left anywhere in Europe. So Ukraine would be strangely an odd man out, which I don't think it will be. So it may not necessarily belong to an alliance in formal terms, at least not the NATO alliance, but still neutrality is something very hard to imagine. With regard to Finland and Sweden, I see this issue in much more relaxed way. I don't think there was much doubt in the Soviet Union and then in the Russian Federation for decades about Sweden's geopolitical strategic orientation. It's always been regarded as an undeclared member of the NATO alliance. Finland, of course, was a different matter. Unlike Sweden, it has a long border with Russia. And during the Cold War, clearly, Finland was a buffer state. They will probably be very unhappy to accept that definition, but it was used by the Soviet Union as a buffer state vis-a-vis the United States-led West, NATO, and other instruments of American power in Europe. To the extent that NATO membership for those two countries that will not be announced in Madrid, but will probably come sooner rather than later. If that happens, a lot will depend in terms of Russia's response on what kind of military deployments, particularly Finland, would allow in its territory, what kind of military activities in terms of military exercises and training, drills, all that it would conduct with NATO partners and allies, whether Finland will turn into a base for U.S. Weapons systems that would be able to reach deep into Russia or not. And the responses will be very, very different. There will be some response in any event, because the border will from the Russian perspective, border with Finland will acquire a very different status. It will be a border with essentially an unfriendly alliance. And that will mean more deployments. That will mean different, more robust military planning. That would probably mean more reliance on nuclear weapons. You would expect that for a country that in conventional military terms is an underdog vis-a-vis the NATO alliance that it faces. So you can see all these things, but what I do not expect to see is anything like what we're seeing in Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, not even a formal ally of the United States, and yet the country has turned into a battlefield, a real battlefield between Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces, supported as they are by the united forces of the West.
Thank you for that. And maybe let me ask Anatol, do you want to react to that? You're still muted at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I myself do not regard NATO membership for Finland and Sweden as of vast importance in military terms. Russia was never going to attack them, and it's very unlikely that they would allow themselves to be used as a base to attack Russia. But what their accession to NATO does is basically complete what for me was a fundamentally disastrous equation drawn by the West after the Cold War between the idea of Europe and the idea of NATO and EU membership. With a sort of just automatically, it's not that this was particularly thought out, except the attitudes of sort of Poles and others, but there was just an automatic assumption that to be truly European, you had to be in NATO and the EU. This, by the way, also helped to create an absolute, unavoidable imperative for the East Europeans to join NATO and the EU, because without doing that, they're basically branding themselves as second-class Europeans or even non-Europeans. And to an extent, what we see now, I think, is the logic of that assumption. NATO and the EU are in the process of swallowing just about everything except for Russia, and Russia has long since, in practical terms, been expelled by the West from Europe and is now drawing the logical conclusions of that. Now, I'd just like to add one thing, though, which I think it depends on what happens in the West, of course, but could be seen as a disastrous mistake by Putin, which is, I heard yesterday a French ambassador say, talking about some state of international affairs at the moment, but and he said that all the European governments and at least liberal elites are in total denial, his words, about not just the possibility, but the probability of a Republican and quite possibly a Trump victory in 2024 in America, because they are so desperately anxious to believe that America and Europe are one in their liberal democratic values. And also, of course, they're so desperately anxious to believe that America will always be there, not just be there for them, but be there as a liberal democracy. That they cannot bear to contemplate, what could turn out to be the reality in America. And of course, this is part of a liberal European evasion of so many other issues over the years. I mean, to take migration, perhaps the biggest example, simply a refusal to confront so many of the real issues and real dangers concerned with that. Well, obviously anyone who keeps their eyes open knows that Trump could win in 2024. And I've just been reading a whole series of books by serious people, not science fiction writers or fantasists, about the real chances of an American civil war in the foreseeable future, given the unbridgeable differences between the two parties and their supporters. Well, it could be that historians of the future will say, if that happens, and I mean, I pray God it doesn't, what on earth was Putin thinking of? He himself has talked so much about Western decadence and the problems of the West. If he believed that, why did he not wait? And essentially wait for the West itself to crumble. And also, of course, if it comes to Ukrainian membership of the EU, not that I myself believe that this is nearly, as likely a prospect as is now officially being made out, but until the war happened, that was almost impossibly remote. So to a great extent, Ukraine was going to remain in this, halfway house, not, in fact, fully part of what we call Europe. And that would have given many, many opportunities for Russia, to not to annex the whole of Ukraine or take over the whole of Ukraine, but to maintain a reasonable degree of influence in Ukraine, shall we say. Now that, of course, is now, as Dmitri said, I mean, that's over. I mean, Ukraine may be formally neutral, but in effect, it will be a Western ally against Russia.
Dmitri, what do you think about that? Why did Russia not just wait?
Well, you have to go into the thinking processes of the person who calls the shots in Russia on all strategic issues, and that's President Putin. You can only guess, you will never know. But my guess would be that he basically came to a conclusion at some point during 2021. He may have been getting there even before that, but I think by 2021, he must have arrived at that conclusion that with regard to Ukraine, time was not on his side. And basically, he decided to go in order not to leave the Ukraine problem to his successors, to a new generation of Russian leaders. I think he said enough, I think, for us to be able to reconstruct that line of thinking. Ukraine was not going to be in the European Union anytime soon. Ukraine's membership in NATO was also unlikely because the United States was not going to guarantee with the blood of its own soldiers, if need be, or with its own existence, if need be, Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So the whole idea of formal NATO or formal EU membership looked very unlikely to be realized, at least by people like myself. But at the same time, you could also see with the naked eye the increase in U.S. Military support for Ukraine, the extensive training of Ukrainian military officers by NATO instructors. And this was also accompanied by the rhetoric of the Ukrainian leadership under Zelensky becoming more and more strident from somewhere in the middle of 2020. There was a period in 2019 after Zelensky was elected president, during which a window of opportunity appeared to be open for direct contacts between the two presidents. And I think that there were preparations underway, even as late as early 2020, to organize meaningful dialogue. But something changed within Ukraine, and Zelensky, who did not have much support in the Ukrainian political class, he was clearly an outsider to the entire political class in Ukraine. In order to survive, he had to reach out to and accept the support of the more nationalist, ultra-nationalist elements in that political class. And that sealed his very different approach toward Russia. During 2021, he became very active in suppressing anything that looked like Russia-friendly. There was a clampdown on, not much covered in the West, I should say, a clampdown on the TV stations that were close to the party of the successor to the party of the regions, the opposition bloc, so-called opposition bloc. And eventually that led to the legal moves against the leaders of the bloc. So you have Zelensky becoming the figurehead for the, let's say, maximalist party in Ukraine that demanded that Russia essentially cease its support for the Donbass republics, that basically talked about recovering not only Donbass, but Crimea as part of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian military doctrine that Putin referred to several times essentially allowed the Ukrainian forces to use military force in order to restore Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea. So the combination of those domestic moves and much closer connections between Ukraine and particularly the United States, I think pushed Putin to consider taking a much proactive stance toward Ukraine. Again, we may agree or disagree, we may challenge each part of that logic, but I think it was that logic, maybe to crown it all was the statement by Zelensky in Munich just a few days before the start of the military operation, Russian military operation in Ukraine, suggesting that Ukraine might revise its non-nuclear status. So all these things, I believe, combined to in Putin's mind to push him toward taking the decision, taking responsibility upon himself, and not leaving the job to be done or else by his eventual successors.
Anatol, the international factor of the NATO factor versus the domestic Ukrainian situation and how internal politics in Ukraine works and how that interacts with Russia. What's your take on that? Which one is more important?
Well, I think they were both very important. I mean, something just to add to what Dmitri said, a couple of things. First, the international dimension, but also the Ukrainian one. This wasn't just last year, it had been building up for a number of years, but so many Russian hopes over the past 30 years, including very much by Putin himself previously, I have to say, were invested in this idea that eventually the French and Germans would distance themselves from America, you know, because of, well, frankly, I mean, the number of messes that America had created, and would, you know, not a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, but would try to reach a series of pragmatic accommodations, shall we say, with Russia. And that hope, I think, was partly kept alive by the Minsk II agreement over the Donbass, which was brokered by the French and Germans, whereby the Donbass separatist republics would re-enter Ukraine, but with full guaranteed autonomy, secured autonomy, and secured also by the international community. Now, in the years following 2015, it gradually became apparent that the Ukrainians were never going to actually implement the terms of that agreement, though that they signed it themselves, that they were never going to pass the necessary laws guaranteeing Donbass autonomy. And it also became clear that the West, including the French and Germans, were never going to bring any serious pressure on the Ukrainians to do so. So I think the running out of that hope was another factor in Putin's decision. Plus, of course, as Dmitri said, the fact that although Ukraine was not going to be a member of NATO, it had become what the Americans call a major non-NATO ally in all but name, and was, of course, being heavily armed. And I think another factor there, which I certainly heard from senior Russians off the record, is that the West has completely forgotten, did not recognize even at the time, that of course in 2014, Russia militarily could have taken half of Ukraine with the greatest of ease. And what's more, had at least two excellent political justifications for doing that. The first was that, after all, Yanukovych was the elected Ukrainian president. Russia could have seized half the country, installed him in Kharkov, said, look, this is the elected president, and then negotiated, and then said, okay, so now, how do we sort this out? And it didn't. I mean, Russia actually showed remarkable restraint, for which I think that the Russian establishment has basically been kicking itself ever since. It's been saying, why, oh why did we not do that, when we had the chance? And then, of course, this feeling that the more and more strongly armed the Ukrainians become, the more difficult or impossible it will be to do that in future. As it turned out, Russia left it too late in any case. It was already impossible, as we saw this year. The second thing, just to add to the various internal things in Ukraine that Dmitri has mentioned, where the whole succession of laws, which, by the way, also violated the Minsk II agreement in Ukraine over the past 2 years, reducing or even in principle abolishing the role of the Russian language in education, public life, the media. Not that, of course, this had been implemented yet on a large scale, but clearly the intention was absolutely clear. Now, of course, in terms of time not being on Russia's side, what this also indicated was that if, at least so I heard from people in Moscow, that if Russia waited too long, the entire cultural basis of the close relationship between Russia and Ukraine would be destroyed over time by measures of Ukrainianization. Now, of course, it's been destroyed by the war, but that's another factor in what happened.
Is that that analysis that Anatol gives about the perception in Moscow at the moment, Dmitri? Is Russia kicking itself for not doing things differently in 2014?
Well, even in 2014, the decision to limit the operation of Russian forces to the control of Crimea and the covert support for the republics in Donbass, that was controversial, and I must say that the mandate that President Putin received from the upper chamber of the Russian parliament in 2014 allowed him to use Russian military forces not just in Crimea or Donbass or any part of Ukraine specifically, but in the entire territory of Ukraine. So he had and Putin is very, very careful to have the proper legal basis for his actions. So he could have, he certainly did have that authority that he chose not to use. He may blame himself for having become too soft on Poroshenko. Actually, when Ukraine held the presidential elections in May 2014, again, Russia had the option of, recognizing that election or not. Former President Yanukovych was in Russia, and it was the decision of President Putin whether to recognize an election held after the illegal ouster of the previous president. So I understand there were conversations between Putin and Poroshenko, and there were some promises made and not kept. Because Ukraine, after Poroshenko had taken power, had moved militarily against the separatists in Donbass. And then, of course, there was something that Anatol mentioned, the Minsk Agreement of 2015, February 2015, which again very much produced a promise on behalf of Ukraine that no one in any senior position in Ukraine was going to fulfill. There was a lot of empty promises or promises not kept, broken by the Ukrainians. And I think this led to this pent-up frustration in the Kremlin with just about any Ukrainian leadership, but also with the US leadership. Putin is very careful not to divulge the details of his conversations with foreign leaders, but he mentioned his conversations with President Obama back in February 2014, which suggests that Putin felt that Obama had promised him something, and Putin kept his part of the bargain, but Obama never kept his. So this is the stuff that 8 years later contributed to the decision that we're talking about. There are many elements that went into that decision, and Anatol and I have discussed some of them. There are several others. It was a complex decision, and history cannot be undone.
No, and the European continent doesn't have a good track record of being fine with itself. In a sense, we're all imperfect Europeans here. The British, who's not part of the European Union, a Swiss who's not part of NATO or the EU, and Russian who's the antithesis apparently to what people imagine as Europe, as unjustified as I think that is. But why is it that for hundreds of years we end up every other decade in internal European conflagration and conflict? We're not getting out of it even after the Cold War, are we?
Well, I mean, in a sense, nobody else in the world is either. In East Asia, they are mired in endless unsolved territorial disputes. Many of them, hangovers of the Second World War. South Asia is still working its way through the consequences of the end of the British Empire, 75 years after it ended, in terms of relations between Muslims and Hindus, India and Pakistan, border issues, territorial issues, identity issues. Africa, don't even go there. North America hasn't, except for Mexico, of course, but because of the tremendous power and unity of the United States. But of course, and as I say, there are serious predictions of this now, the United States itself crumbles, as a united democratic state, then we'll see, very much of the same thing there. As, by the way, we saw, in the 1860s with the American Civil War, the consequences of which America is still working its way through. today. But yeah, I mean, we are too diverse, too divided a continent with deep, of course, historical hostilities and rivalries which have been suppressed but not abolished. And we also did just basically ruin ourselves in what has been called the European Civil War of 1914 to 1945. The European great powers effectively destroyed each other, and as a result, we have a row of states which don't want to fight each other. Clearly, even if you go over to the sort of extreme right wingers in France or Germany, they're none of them thinking of replaying 1914 or 1939 and going to war with each other, but they are incapable of taking collective responsibility for their own continent. They and then all those years of the Cold War and dependence on the United States. We are a broken continent, I'm afraid, of dependence.
Dmitri, can we do something to fix the broken continent and be fine from Portugal to Vladivostok, from Porto to Vladivostok?
Well, I think what's happening today in Russia is a change in the approach to Russia's geography. And I think that the situation in Ukraine, the war that's going on there, is accelerating that change. Russia, following 2014, when its almost unique, historically unique drive to become part of Europe ended in failure, become integrated with one way or another with the rest of the European continent ended in failure. It pivoted to itself. And that, I think, was a major change in Russia's self-image. What I think is happening right now, and will only deepen in the years and maybe decades ahead, is Russia turning away from the West, including Europe, and defining itself as a non-Western country, and looking not so much at Europe as its neighborhood, as greater Eurasia, with an emphasis on Asian countries to the east of Russia, to the south of Russia, and having historically the weakest relationship with Europe since maybe the days of pre-Petrine Russia, let's say the 15th century, 17th century, that period. That, I think, is what is coming, and that will be a big change. This, just as Anatol was saying, that the cultural foundation of Russian-Ukrainian relations was being profoundly changed. I see a similar process happening between Russia and Europe, actually happening on both ends. Both the Europeans, a lot of them, mentally expelling Russia from their notion of Europe forever. And many Russians, much as they only recently wanted to be Europeans or wanted to be seen as Europeans, are turning away from Europe. And this will be a very different relationship, I think, between Russia and Europe than anything we've had so far.
Maybe it's going to be the moment when we finally understand that we're all Eurasians, since Russia is the obvious link together with Turkey and the others. I mean, we are one continent, one huge landmass, and maybe that's even more difficult than being European. But
well, it's an interesting question, because I've often said, in Western contexts where people say, oh, this Russian idea of Eurasianism, this is what, one of the things that divides Russia from Europe. And I've said, look, aren't we all Eurasians now? Britain has a huge Pakistani and Indian community with very, very close ties to their homelands. France, of course, and Belgium have enormous North African Muslim communities. Germany has huge Turkish communities. We're all Eurasians. How that will play out in terms of European identity, but I think in future, the idea of a united European identity with Russia as the other will also be very, very complicated and conflicted.
Dmitri, do you see a way for us to be together as Eurasians with China and India and Russia and the European states in a way that even if they don't love each other, at least you are in a balance and we don't fight?
Well, that would only happen if Western Europe, or United Europe, I should say, prioritizes its relations with the rest of this grand Eurasian continent over its relations with the United States. I don't think the United States would be amused by having its most important allies turning away from the Atlantic and accepting this continental vision that includes China and India and the Arabs and Russia. Frankly, I don't think I will see myself the day when it becomes a reality. Maybe it will never be a reality.
Okay, gentlemen, I think time is running out, but I thank you very much. The one thing we can do is keep the intellectual discussion going, because I absolutely hate the fragmentation that we're going through, and I despise the fact that we are asked not to interact culturally and intellectually. It's an abomination. So I hope we can do something against this at least.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your effort, Pascal.
Thank you very much for talking.
It was great to see you, Anatol. Thank you.
Certainly, Dmitri, and let's talk again soon.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's be in touch, everybody. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.